Welcome, everyone, to one of our first Weber on Wednesday event here at the Iowa City Public Library. My name is Maeve Clark, and I'm the Coordinator of Adult Services at the library. And every May, we celebrate local history, and we call it Weber Days because of Irving Weber. So many of you who are here today or watching this on Library Channel may know of Irving Weber. He was a local historian who wrote many articles for the Iowa City Press Citizen, which are digitized now at the University of Iowa's history website, and which we use often at the Iowa City Public Library. And he's a perfect person to have honored by naming our local history programming about him. In the back of the library, in the back of the meeting room, we have a flyer on Weber Days. So there's another event tonight, which is about RAGBRAI, and bicyclists who've gone on RAGBRAI are going to do reminiscences of it. RAGBRAI will be coming through Iowa City this year, the second time ever. And on Saturday, we have another really interesting program where Oscar Beasley, a retired doctor in Iowa City, is going to show photographs of the early urban renewal time, 1968 and 1970, and then he and his son have gone out and taken pictures of those same locations, and he's going to do a comparison of those. So those are our three events for this week. And today's event I'm really excited about because 6-on-6 girls basketball has memories, very pleasant, happy memories for me, and we're very excited to have our two speakers here. So I have a brief introduction for them, and then I'll turn it over, and I'm hoping that people in the audience have questions for them or reminiscences of playing 6-on-6 girls basketball, or you can talk about 5-on-5. It's okay. The evolution of girls basketball. So Kären Mason is one of our presenters, and she is the curator of the Louise Nunn Mary Louise Smith Iowa Women's Archives, University of Iowa Libraries, a position she has held since the establishment of the archives in 1992. And if you've never been to the archives, you must go. Must go. She can tell us more about those. She earned a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College, a master's degree from the University of Minnesota, and a PhD from the University of Michigan, all in history. She is a native Minnesotan, but claims Iowa roots by way of three grandparents who grew up in Iowa before heading north. So you get to be here for local history. Mason's involvement with women's history dates to the late 70s when she worked on Women's History Sources Project at the University of Minnesota and co-authored a women's history tour of the Twin Cities. She's published various articles on women's histories and archives, including a grand manuscript search, the Women's History Sources Survey at the University of Minnesota, 1975 to 1979, in Perspectives on Women's Archives. With Jennifer Sterling, Katrina Parrott, and Susan Burrell, Sports Studies faculty at the University of Iowa, Department of American Studies, she curated the traveling exhibition 6-on-6 Basketball and the Legacy of Girls and Women's Sport in Iowa, which is currently touring Iowa with the Smithsonian Institution's Museum on Main Street Hometown Teams exhibition. Is it in Mount Vernon still, or is it?
No, it's in Ottumwa now.
It's moved to Ottumwa. It's like girls basketball. It's all over the state. Jennifer Sterling, Jen, is a lecturer in the Department of American Studies at the University of Iowa. She arrived at Iowa after completing her PhD in kinesiology, physical cultural studies at the University of Maryland, an internship and research post with the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, and a postdoctoral fellowship with the Sports Society and Technology program at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on sport and visual culture, including art, exhibits, medical imaging, and data visualization, and she teaches classes on inequality in American sport, race and ethnicity in sport, and women's sport and culture, among others. What are the others? Do they just go on and on and on?
Yes, they do.
But perhaps most importantly, Jen is also a native of Iowa, Fremont, Iowa, and a former 6-on-6 basketball player herself, although she looks far too young, but I'll let her tell that story. So, thank you for coming, and
hello, it's great to be here. I'm Kären Mason, and I'm actually from Minnesota, as Maeve said. So I didn't know about 6-on-6 until I arrived here in 1992. And as many of you know, that was the very final year of 6-on-6 girls basketball, so there's a lot of hubbub surrounding 6-on-6 that year, and so I got to learn about it just in time to see it pass out of existence. But I'm very happy to be here today. This is the end of we're coming to the end of the 25th anniversary celebration year of the Iowa Women's Archives. We have had, over the past year, 2 major exhibits and 2 symposia, starting last July, and now this traveling exhibition, which will be traveling throughout the year, this year, throughout 2018. But the first few events were all located in Iowa City, and we wanted to do something to reach out to the rest of the state. And knowing that it was the 25th anniversary of the end of 6-on-6 basketball, we thought this would be a great way to get the Iowa Women's Archives out across the state to both thank the people who have donated collections and supported the archives over the years, and to bring it to the attention of people who haven't, and then to also collect the history of girls and women's sports throughout the state. So with that idea in mind, I contacted my friend Susan Burrell in sports studies, and she said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and she enlisted Tina Parrott and Jen Sterling, and Jen had barely just arrived when we started talking about this, but it turns out she had worked on Smithsonian Museums on Main Street traveling exhibit, so she was the perfect person to come on board besides all her knowledge of the field. So for a couple of years we worked on getting that exhibit ready, and it just had its first stop in Mount Vernon, and is now in Ottumwa. And at the back there are flyers that tell all the places it's going to be throughout the year. And at each of those, we're going to do a collecting day where we try to gather materials on girls and women's sports. So 6-on-6 is the hook to get people interested, but we're also more broadly interested in girls and women's sports and preserving their history. So the Iowa Women's Archives, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is in the 3rd floor of the main library. It's a public resource. It's open to the public. We gather the history of Iowa women, broadly defined as women who were born or educated or resided for some part of their lives in Iowa. And we do that by preserving photos, diaries, letters, scrapbooks, organization records, and audiovisual materials, anything that tells us the story of Iowa women. And we have over 1,200 collections now. So today I'm going to talk, as you know, about 6-on-6 girls basketball. So basketball was invented in 1891 by James Naismith at Springfield College in Massachusetts. And by the following year, it was being played at Smith College and at the University of California. Already in 1893, there's a record of girls and women playing at the Dubuque YWCA. And in 1894, women were playing basketball at Iowa Agricultural College, now ISU, as in this photograph. And as you can see, they weren't playing in a gym, they were playing outdoors. So they often played outdoors on grass or dirt courts. By 1905, basketball was being played by girls at towns all around Iowa. But it wasn't the game of basketball that we know today in some respects. Early on, the court was divided into 3 sections. Although the number of players varied depending on the size of the gym, there could be from 5 players to 9 players. But in the traditional 6-player game, there were 2 forwards, 2 centers, and 2 guards. And after every made basket, there had to be a jump ball in the center. So the games were slow and very low scoring, sometimes 4-2 or 10-6. And only 2 dribbles were allowed. No one could pass out of their section across the line into the next section, and only forwards could shoot the ball. So sometimes the courts were in church basements, sometimes they were in high school gyms, and sometimes they were called cracker box courts because the gyms were so small. And if you note on this diagram at the bottom, I've noted that the diagram specifies that there should be 2 inches from the sidelines and back lines to the walls. As you can imagine, that could present hazards. Fans on the perimeter who might stick their foot out on purpose, maybe, or just by accident. Sometimes there were pot-bellied stoves in the middle of the gym that people had to work around. And this is a photo of a 6-on-6 team in their positions with their opponents. Looks like a practice with their female coach. This is a Forest City High School team. This is actually my grandmother's basketball team, and I think she might be that woman with her back to us right in the middle of the, hey, if I've got this, I might as well use it. Right in the middle of the court. And as you can see, this court was not a Cracker Box gym. This is a pretty nice gym. It even had a balcony where the fans could sit and watch. Sadly, this gym no longer exists. That high school has been torn down. So my grandmother, Melinda, played basketball in the late 19-teens. She was a guard. She was about my size. My Aunt Edna Hoos, her sister, was a forward. My grandmother, Melinda Hoos, is this woman, the dreamy-eyed one. Her sister Edna over there, in motion, is the guard. And she went on to become a physical education teacher. And she was also about my size. Size didn't matter so much. I didn't know about that she had played basketball. It wasn't something she talked about. But when I arrived here and I was talking to my uncle about this in Minnesota, he said that he had a photograph album from her high school days. And in the photo album were photos, these photos that I've shown you of her playing basketball or on the basketball team. And they were just these tiny, like 1 by 1 inch photos that blew up beautifully to make these great photos that have hung on the wall of the archives throughout its history. So you see the team looks a little bit cocky. We love this photo because it's not just a posed photo, and you get a sense of these girls looking like girls today, Some of their hairstyles are a little different, interesting bows in their hair, some of them, but they look pretty similar except for those bloomers. They were probably a little cocky because they were having a good season when this was taken in 1918. 2 years earlier, not so much. Their coach, Miss Reinwald, had motivated them in 1916 by taking them to the movies. She said, all the girls had a grand time and they say they'll lose no more games from now on, as was reported in the local paper. So I guess that was right, because a year later they were much improved. And in fact, there was a poem dedicated to the team in the local newspaper. It said, it was written by a young man, and be sure to note that the Hooses are mentioned in the poem. To the girls, to the Hooses and the Browns, besmeared with grime and mud, go gallantly in to get the ball and quit, all bathed in blood. A Jensen knocks a Reagan down and kicks her in the chest. The high school girl is carried home and gently laid to rest. Well, here and there a little freshie collapses neath the pile, and the undertakers get more business than they've had for quite a while. So much for the kinder, gentler girls' version of the game. Girls' basketball was clearly popular among the boys in Forest City, and also evident from another item in the Forest City Summit in 1917, which read, on last Thursday evening, the girls' basketball team held a spread in the domestic science parlors of the school. During the evening, they were visited by several of their boy admirers who entered the building via windows and fresh air entrances. So you can see that there were very spacious windows in the domestic science room, which would have allowed the boys' entry. This information about the team comes from deep research that my uncle did on family history, reading through the newspapers of Forest City. And it's wonderful that there were these accounts of not just the score totals in the game and that sort of thing, but even the more of the culture, the youth culture in town, and the importance that girls' basketball had for the local community. Too bad the newspapers these days aren't like that. So girls' basketball spread like wildfire across Iowa in the early 20th century. But there was more to it than simply the game. Uniforms were a big deal and continue to be throughout the history of 6-on-6, as you can see from this photo. The players wore bloomers, heavy socks, sailor blouses called middies, and canvas shoes with what they called electric soles to grip the floor. I think that just meant rubber, but they called them electric soles. And in the 19 teens and 20s, it was common to wear bows and hats even while playing. They had a lot of fun, not just playing the game, but when they played other teams, they often took the train, and because of the train schedule, they were often forced to stay overnight with the other team, so they had a lot of fun. In the early 1920s, tournaments were held at different sites around Iowa, including Audubon and Iowa Falls and elsewhere. But in 1925, the Iowa High School Athletic Association ended girls' tournaments, in part because of concerns about girls' health. They thought it might be too strenuous. And also, women physical educators who trained many of the coaches were opposed to inter-school competition. They wanted all girls to participate in physical activity, and they thought that tournaments focused too much attention on basketball and left out other girls. They also feared that an emphasis on profit-making would exploit the girls who were basketball players. So cities and big towns began dropping girls' basketball, except for intramurals played within the school. But it was a little too late for some. Some girls were already smitten with basketball, such as Gwen Johnson from Newhall, pictured here. When the Newhall School District in Benton County threatened to end girls' basketball, Gwen and her friends got on their ponies and they rode from farm to farm with petitions asking the school, getting people to sign these petitions to say that they didn't want girls' basketball to be dropped. They wanted it continued. Whether it was their efforts or what, we don't know not what, but the district decided to keep girls' basketball, and that's a good thing because in 1927, those determined girls led Newhall to a state championship. So they were one of the earliest state champions under the newly formed Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union, which we will call the Union for simplicity's sake, which was formed by a group of 25 men, superintendents and principals who also coached basketball. They began to sponsor county, district, and state competition in 1926. And here is that Newhall team. The girl with her arms crossed on the left is Gwen Johnson, who I just spoke about. In those early years, the tournament sites rotated from Hampton, Centerville, Ida Grove, and Perry. In 1927, when Newhall went to the tournament, it was in Centerville, 150 miles from Newhall. The team traveled by train, but only 7 fans came with them because it was so far away. And if we thought that was far away, imagine the Sioux Center team from Northwest Iowa that had to travel 350 miles to get to the tournament. Those fans from Newhall flew to get to the game, which I would love to learn more about that. That just seems astonishing. The fans back in Newhall gathered in Herman Moller's restaurant. He'd leased a phone to get the play-by-play coverage of the game, but the phone in Centerville was outside the gym, so one of the fans would watch the game, run to the phone to relay the action to the fans back in Newhall, and then go back into the game. Newhall trailed 21-10 at halftime, but as time ticked off the clock, the forward scored 28 quick points, shooting the game-winning basket with seconds to spare. So Newhall beat Sioux Center 38-37. They caught the train back to Cedar Rapids, where cars met them to carry them back along the muddy Lincoln Highway to Newhall. There they were met by the band and a cheering crowd. There was a parade, revelry, and even doggerel, a poem dedicated to the team spoofing Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. The team formed lifelong friendships and held annual reunions with their coach, Franklin, even though they all talked about how stern he was as a coach. 200 miles west of Newhall, another girl had been bitten by this basketball bug. As we know from two lovely memory books she kept and donated to the Iowa Women's Archives. Sarah Aline White of Ida Grove, pictured here perched on the basketball on the left in this 1915 player of her older sister's team, was only 4 years old when this picture was taken and dreaming of playing basketball herself one day, and she did. Here she is. Where's the... There, in the middle. In the 1928 Ida Grove team, which was a state championship team, the team also won the championship the following year. And in the album that she donated to us, she gave an account of the trip to Perry to play the state championship. It's a multi-page handwritten document that's just lovely. She writes about getting there. We left the schoolhouse about 10 Thursday morning in McCutcheon's car, Sylvia, Mary Iverson, and Pete in front, and Miss Loppy, Virginia, and myself in back. We ate lunch in Jefferson and then continued our journey. The roads were terrible, and we got stuck in some gumbo mud about 6 miles from Perry. The glue-like stuff was over our right running board, and although we dug with a big fork in our lily-white hands and pushed, while a truck and Mr. Sankey pulled, we couldn't budge the Buick. Finally, Mr. Sankey took the first 6 into town, and we all had to get out when he drove over another bad spot. Once they arrived in town and got their stuff into the hotel, they went for a stroll where several cars full of handsome young men and even handsomer automobiles asked them to go riding with them. I'm wondering where the chaperones were at this point, but they chose to get into a nice Packard, and the young men showed them the sights of town, but a Chrysler was chasing them, so they turned down a cross street to ditch them and got stuck in the mud. And then there was a basketball game as part of the whole event too, but when they won the tournament, and she writes, how we hated to leave Perry and all the good-looking men. On the way home, they drove from bump to bump and rut to rut. Arriving in Ida Grove, they were met by the band and almost everyone in town. They formed a parade and marched following the band down Main Street to the football field, where a perfectly enormous victory bonfire was lighted and 20 pounds of very loud dynamite set off. They knew how to celebrate in those days. But we also have other collections of relating to 6-on-6, including a wonderful collection of photos, clippings, scorebooks, and other papers of Melba Cardamon Olsen, who, as Melba Cardamon, played on that Newhall championship team, whose photo you saw earlier. Her collection documents not only her high school basketball career, but her teaching and coaching career. In the 1920s, most coaches were women, many of whom had been trained in physical education, but taught other subjects. So Melba Cardamon earned a teaching degree at University of Northern Iowa, called Iowa State Teachers College at the time, and then taught for 6 years until she married and was forced to resign. She taught kindergarten and first grade in Witten in Hardin County from 29 to 33, and her contracts for there and Conrad, where she taught second grade from 33 to 35, both say, she'll teach kindergarten, first grade, and coach high school girls basketball. So among her materials are this wonderful photo album of all the snapshots of the Witten High School team. And I love these photo albums because you just see the girls goofing around. We have quite a number of photos taken by professional photographers, which are very different, very posed. And look at this one, emphasizing their femininity, just like the one you saw on the first screen. And you notice the uniforms are changing too. They're now showing legs and wearing shorts. While Melba Cardamon, that's Melba Cardamon on the left in the skirt. And while she was coaching in 1930s, big changes occurred in girls basketball in Iowa. In 1931, the Iowa Girls High School Athletic Union voted to hold its championship in Des Moines at Drake. And that was where it was until 1955, when it moved to Veterans Memorial Arena. And in 1935, Iowa switched to the two-court or half-court game at the end of the season with three guards, excuse me. So I can't add, 3 forwards and 3 guards. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer Sterling.
Thank you. So I'm taking sort of 1930s and 40s onward through the transition period and then the end of 6-on-6 in 1993. So we don't have a lot in the archives around the 30s and 40s, which is one of the reasons we are making an effort to get out and collect a little bit more. And however, the things that we do have in the collection really illustrate what was going on in the rest of the nation as well. So like we've talked about, we're starting to see a shift to the two-court game or the 6-on-6 game during this time period. And there's actually a couple of organizations and teams that are playing 5-on-5. So there's more opportunities for women to play outside of high school once they graduate. And so these include things like the AIB uniforms you see here. So this was a common advertisement we saw in the state tournament programs during this time. And this is an example of the industrial or business type leagues that women were able to join while they were continuing their education or while they were working. So the Langerman twins that you see here also went on to play in Olsen's All-American Redhead. So this was a barnstorming, touring, 5-on-5. You know, they would roll up into town and sort of challenge the local men's teams to games. And that happened through the 80s. So it was a very extended period of time this group of women played. So the Langerman twins are early players in that particular league. And they played in a number of different towns around Iowa, and this is sort of catching up with them in the 50s. Oh, what are they doing now? And so they talk about their history. And I like, there's a part here at the end that talks about so it's Jean and Joe Langerman. So Jean is married with a daughter, and Joe is, quote, still looking over the field. And this is something we'll talk a little bit more about later, but often so this is from the Iowa Girls Basketball Yearbooks, will start getting published around this time. And they often have this sort of balance of promoting girls' sports, but also sort of talking about femininity and marital status and etiquette and hygiene. So this is kind of a common narrative to see sort of the mix of talking about their basketball talents with the fact that they're still looking for husbands or that they do have husbands and are settling down. And then Betty Francis, who you also see here, this is a baseball card, obviously from the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, which is the league that was created during World War II when the men were off at war. And so there's some Iowa roots here. Betty was from Monmouth, Iowa, and this actually comes to us through a friend of hers whose collection we have in the archive, so Ernella Van Horn. And then, of course, during this time, we're also seeing rising stars like Babe Diedrichson, who play in the AAU leagues. And, you know, she leads her team to an AAU national championship. She also wins a couple of gold medals at the 32 Olympics. So we are starting to see an expansion of opportunities for women. So much of the information we have about the 50s, 60s, and again back into the 40s is coming to us through these official Iowa Girl basketball yearbooks that are published by the union each year for a number of decades. And then they've come to us as well, this collection. We don't have a complete collection. This is one of the things we're looking for. But the collection we do have comes to us largely from Janice Barron, who researched the 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa for her book, From 6-on-6 to Full Court Press, A Century of Iowa Girls Basketball. So this is part of her research collection, things that people donated to her that were then donated to us. So the annual yearbook really highlights this heyday of 6-on-6 basketball that we start experiencing in the 50s and 60s. And this, of course, is led by longtime union executive director E. Wayne Cooley. You can't talk about 6-on-6 without talking about Cooley. So it enters this new period of popularity, really pushed by a new home at Veterans Memorial Auditorium. And that happens in '55, they move there. And he institutes this very elaborate, entertaining sort of event. And he's talked about as the P.T. Barnum of hoops. He's a masterful marketer. There's halftime shows, there's high school bands, there's dance teams, there's Hall of Fame inductions. There's always something going on. And so the tournament itself becomes very popular. 6-on-6 becomes very popular. And that in turn actually supports a growth of girls' sports in Iowa. So they add a number of different teams during this time. They expand to include everything from bowling to golf and tennis, et cetera. So, and they just keep expanding through the 50s and 60s. So during this sort of heyday is when we hear a lot about these stories that sort of get repeated and are legendary, become legendary in their retelling. And one of those, of course, is the 1959 blizzard. So all the roads were closed to Des Moines. Everyone that was at the state tournament was stuck inside vets. And there's a DJ that trudged his record collection through the snow so that they could entertain all of these people that were left. And obviously sort of geared towards the teenagers that were left in the auditorium rather than the adults that were also stuck in there with them. So, and this is also the 50s and 60s, we start seeing really high-scoring forwards, people like Denise Long from Union Witten, so she sets the scoring record in '69. And then it's later broken by Lynn Lorenzen, also like these two people you sort of, again, can't talk about 6-on-6 without mentioning them. And Long actually goes on to be the first woman ever drafted by an NBA team. So she's drafted by the NBA's San Francisco Warriors. It's a stunt. It doesn't actually come to fruition. But again, Iowa girls 6-on-6 players are being noticed at a national level because of their success. So there, again, we're starting to see that expansion we started to see nationally continues in the 50s and 60s. The LPGA Tour is created during this time. And we also start seeing some growing opportunities around African-American athletes. So Althea Gibson and Wilma Rudolph are also people who sort of excel in sports during this period, not without struggles to have that success, however. And I'll speak a little bit about the diversity of players in Iowa as well. So the other thing that the yearbooks do is sort of highlight, like I talked about earlier, this ongoing cultural tension between sort of promoting that athleticism while demonstrating their femininity. And so it's played out both on the covers, quite obviously at times, and also in between with these various articles that they would include. You've got one.
1949.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Again, there's so many more of these out there that we haven't seen yet. So one of the patterns we have seen in the ones that we do have is around this idea of so the the manners make friends, so this is sort of the etiquette, and I think my glasses keep steaming up. I'm going to take them off. So manners make friends. So we see some of this etiquette-driven articles. We see everything from like how to file your nails to how to behave when you get to the hotel in Des Moines and that type of thing. And then we also see some of these articles that are addressing what Kären talked about earlier around the idea of basketball maybe being too rigorous for girls. And so this is, we see a lot of these different articles over time and sort of these different changing opinions. And so this one is claiming, of course, that evidence now proves that girls are able to take basketball in stride, that it okays feminine endurance, and that girls are 70% as strong as boys. So again, this is the type of research that was going on at the time to sort of support. This was it seems sort of like a backhanded support, but it was supportive of girls playing basketball. So the next era we're going to talk about is the 70s. So we see this huge rise in opportunities for girls and women in the 70s, partly due to the passage of Title IX in 1972. So Title IX often gets attributed to sport. However, it actually technically reads, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So it's the fact that these sports are taking place in schools. If they were all taking place in recreational centers, and that were not receiving any kind of public funding, this would not be an issue. However, the schools received public funding, so they needed to make sure there wasn't discriminatory practices carrying on. So the other thing that happens in the 70s is in 1971, the rest of the nation adopts 5-on-5 rules for girls basketball. So there's a number of holdouts initially, and by the end of this decade, Tennessee and Texas have both gotten rid of 6-on-6, some through legal challenges, others just saw the writing on the wall. But Oklahoma and Iowa carry on until Iowa in 93 and Oklahoma in 1995. So there's other challenges going on, again, just to situate this nationally. Billie Jean King leads efforts for equal pay at the U.S. Open. In Little League Baseball admits girls following a number of legal challenges in 1974. So the challenges that were going on in Iowa, that I'll start sort of talking about, were not that uncommon considering what was going on in the rest of the nation. So I'm just going to highlight 5 different athletes here. And these, again, this is something we have quite a bit more in our collection from. So during the 70s, not that we don't want more, we can always use more. So this is a time period where girls are still playing 6-on-6 in Iowa. However, scholarships are starting to be offered for 5-on-5 to play collegiate sports following their high school careers. So Julie Goodrich is one of the athletes. She's a multi-sport athlete. Again, so we've had this expansion of sports, so you're not just playing basketball anymore. She's a multi-sport athlete. They're the runner-up in 73 in the state tournament, and she goes on to play college basketball at Iowa State University. And is quite disappointed by the lack of following that the college team has after playing high school 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa. And she's also disappointed to find out that they share warm-ups with the volleyball team during the same season. So it's not like the volleyball team had it first and then the basketball team got it. They actually, I don't know if they had games at the same time or how they managed that, but. And then the next people we'll talk about is 2 players that went on to play professional basketball. So Iowa had its own women's professional basketball team, the Iowa Cornets. It was part of the short-lived Women's Basketball League. So the league was only in existence for 3 years. But you see Machine Gun Molly, due to her shooting style and her skill. Machine Gun Molly Bolin, she's from Moravia. And so this is a publicity photo from the Iowa Cornets. So again, you can see some of that ongoing femininity and sexualization that sort of accompanies women's participation in sport, and often still does. And then a jacket from Rhonda Pink-White, who also played for the Iowa Cornets. And she goes on and coaches at Oral Roberts, which is the university she played at as well. So she graduated from Ankeny. So again, we're starting to see this broadening opportunities for women, but still not equal opportunities. And then there's Jane Rubel. So this is early 70s, 71. And Jane Christopher Rubel was a player who got married and had a child, and the union's bylaws did not allow that at the time. So she challenged it legally and won. But I think this letter is really interesting. This is part of an appendix for the lawsuit. And it talks about, in accordance with all of these union laws. And then I've asked a girls' basketball coach, Mr. Richard Barber, to deliver this letter to you personally so there will be no misunderstanding of your position. So again, this is an example of how women were trying to sort of change the narrative and continue to play the games they wanted to play in the times they wanted to play them. And then this is sort of the outcome of the challenge. So faced with the lawsuit, rather than going to court, the union goes ahead and repeals the rule about women with a status being associated with being married or being a mother could actually go ahead and still play. And then the last thing I want to mention in the 70s is the Association for the Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, the AIAW. So this is an organization that I'm very familiar with because I work in the sports studies program here and in the Department of American Studies. And this has been an organization that's been very well researched by our staff and our graduate students. And actually a lot of what we know about the AIAW in sport history generally has come from the University of Iowa and largely from archives that are held here. So this is a very important collection, a very important organization. So in 1971, the AIAW is founded, and it develops out of a number of earlier women's sports organizations. And the AIAW governs collegiate sports between 1972 and 1982. So the NCAA has no interest in women's sports whatsoever until the AIAW starts hosting tournaments and starts hosting successful tournaments. So in 1981, then, the NCAA initiates its own women's championships, and the schools have to decide if they're going to be members of the AIAW or the NCAA. So by 1982, then, and this is a very condensed history of this, but by 1982, the AIAW is sort of forced to cease operation as the affiliate schools start going with the NCAA, which has more money and sort of broadcast contracts, et cetera. However, at the height of its membership, the AIAW included nearly 1,000 universities and colleges. So that brings us to some of the transitions that start happening here in Iowa in the 80s. And I think what I'll focus on here, just for time, for the sense of time, is the legal challenge that leads to the union to decide in 1985 to let schools pick whether they get to play 5-on-5 or 6-on-6. So it's a school-by-school decision. And I've got a couple of maps that will sort of show you where that separation occurs. So 13-year-old Jolene Inslow from Indianola, Carrie Wolf, 12-year-old from Des Moines, and Shauna Russell, a 14-year-old from Lamoni, sue the state for discriminatory practices around 6-on-6, so a couple of junior high kids. And so they say that the 6-on-6 is hindering their chances of playing in college and earning scholarships. And again, so in order to avoid the lawsuit, the union changes its rules in 1985 and lets the schools decide which version of the game that they're going to play. So in the first season, 24 teams, 24 schools switch, and then they host tournaments for both 6-on-6 and 5-on-5 from 1985 to 1993. And there's no divisions. I know we're all familiar with the divisions, 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A. That doesn't happen until everyone's playing 5-on-5. So what does this look like? So what we've tried to do is take the union's data, the historical data around who played in the state tournaments when, and we have data at the state tournament level, but we do not have data on what schools were just participating in what sports in what years. We don't have that sort of nuanced, smaller level data. So this is all state tournament qualifiers. So what we start seeing in 85 to 93 is that larger schools, which hadn't been offering sports to their girls prior to this, are starting to offer sports. And because they don't want to have to go through that period of transition between 6-on-6 and 5-on-5, they're just adopting 5-on-5 right away. So the way it changes the landscape of girls basketball in Iowa generally is that the larger towns, so the larger circles are the larger towns. So this is just a close-up of the key. The larger towns are playing 5-on-5, and then the smaller towns are playing 6-on-6. And this is sort of rural-urban and also a question of diversity. So we overlaid it with a demographic population map. Again, so just so you can see, not only are the urban areas, but the more diverse areas are ending up playing 6-on-6.
Was it 5-on-5 before Iowa City was?
Yeah, well, so again, these are only the state tournaments. So Iowa City just did not happen to go to the state tournament. I know it's a rarity to have like that period of time and not have Iowa City at the state tournament, but that's the only reason Iowa City is not there. So
Would have been 5-on-5 too, you're saying?
yeah, so Solon went 5-on-5. A lot of the smaller towns around the larger, more densely populated areas did turn to 5-on-5 a little quicker. And we also saw that with private schools. And again, the feeling with that is that private schools weren't under the same sort of public pressure to keep 6-on-6 as some of the public schools might have been. So again, mostly sort of small blue circles playing 6-on-6, and they only changed when they had to. And then the ones that were sort of early adopters were larger cities. And then I've just got a close-up of this region, just because you all might be a little bit more familiar with this region. So you can kind of see it on a tighter, more tightly focused scale here. So some of the smaller towns in the blue, and then some of the larger. And the ones that overlap, like Waterloo, Columbus, transitioned during this time period. So we were looking to see what happened, like what schools were moving around and when during that time period. We've still got a lot of data to continue to play with. So, and I just want to mention again, so we start seeing this increased diversity in the landscape of girls sport in Iowa, and girls basketball in Iowa in particular. So Tanya Warren, who's now the coach at UNI, so she's an all-state player in 1983. We had to go outside of our archives to get this image, and I just want to make a plug for public libraries here and their efforts for digitization and preservation. So we wouldn't have really been able to find this without access to this collection. And then once we realized, we were actually looking to see if we could find, who was the first, where are these African-American players? When did they start, having a presence at the state tournament? And so Dolores Brown, 1953, is actually the first African-American Hall of Fame inductee to the Union's Basketball Hall of Fame. And so it's nice to see like a big town and some diversity early in Iowa, but that doesn't really pick up momentum until the mid-'80s. So the final 6-on-6 tournaments in 1993. I always feel like that's a history that everyone knows. Like if you were raised in Iowa, everyone knows that. Again, it was largely led by the girls themselves and wanting to be able to play in college and make that transition more easily. And they start sort of losing support for the modified rules. The reasons that the modified rules were in place to begin with, it doesn't really have that support anymore. And so this is just a picture of the final game. And this is Hubbard Radcliffe over Atlantic. So, so they're the final 6-on-6 champion and in the final state tournament in 1993. So, I think I'm just going to hand it back to Kären just to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do with the collection and the exhibition. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but.
So this is our exhibit, 6-on-6 and basketball and the legacy of girls and women's sport in Iowa. It's 6 large banners that tell the history of 6-on-6 in the context, the broader context of girls and women's sports nationally, statewide, nationally, and internationally. And then our final banner, what's your story? Every woman has a story, every girl has a voice. That's sort of our motto for the 25th anniversary. And what's your story? To get people thinking about whether they have material in closets or stories that they want to tell. And so, as we mentioned earlier, the exhibit will be traveling around to Ottumwa, Guthrie Center, Jefferson, Ames, and Conrad. And then we're going to Spencer after that, which is not part of the Smithsonian exhibit, but there weren't any Smithsonian sites in Northwest Iowa, so we're going to go there probably in January. And at each of these places, we're going to have a collecting day where we invite people to come and bring their material that they would like to donate to the archives or to just tell us about. And so we so that's what we're doing. And please pick up the material on the back table there that tells about these collecting days. We don't have all the dates of the collecting days nailed down yet. We know Ottumwa will be in Ames in the fall and Guthrie Center in July, and we're trying to work out the other dates. We also have an event next Tuesday at the University of Iowa Main Library. It's 6-on-6 girls basketball, a conversation with Hawkeyes coach Lisa Bluter, Julie Goodrich, Blake, who was a track star and basketball star at Adele in the 70s, who donated her papers to the archives right after we opened, and Shelley Lucas, who got her her PhD here at Iowa in sports studies and teaches kinesiology at Boise State, and she wrote her dissertation on the switch from 6-on-6 to 5-on-5 in Iowa, and it was called Courting Controversy. And then it will be moderated by Susan Burrell. So please come to that event on Tuesday evening at 6:30 in Chambord. It will be a lot of fun.
What's the date again, please?
Tuesday, May 15th at 6:30 p.m. And we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. Are there any questions or comments? Some of you apparently. Chambord Auditorium in the University of Iowa Main Library, and because it's in the evening, you'll be able to park in that lot, the library lot west of the library. It's cashiered, but you're welcome there.
Can I just have you share what you brought with you?
I just read about this in the paper this morning, so I spent, 2 hours going through boxes.
Great.
Some people here who might be very interested in
Yeah.
some of these things.
I'm from Iowa County, from Victor, and my mother played girls' basketball in 1922 until her mother found out that that's what she was doing and made her quit
Really?
because she was afraid she'd get sick. Girls shouldn't do things like that. But Victor had, well, I should say Iowa County, had a tournament all of its own. And we have 7 teams in Iowa County alone then. And so this was a 3-day tournament just for the county. And then the-
We're so excited to see that kind of thing, because we really, as Jen said, we mostly have stuff about the state tournaments, and we really want to find out about these other places where it was played, in the county,
Yeah.
and that they didn't go to the state tournament necessarily. Some of them did.
Then the next tournament was sectional, and this one was at Brooklyn, which is 8 miles away. The next one was district, which is at Coe College in Cedar Rapids. And then finally, the state tournament. Right here.
That is great.
And this is from 1949.
That's wonderful.
Unfortunately, my team never made it to state, but we always took a busload of girls.
Did you have fun playing?
Oh, yes, yeah.
So
And,
your mother wanted you to play because she
oh,
couldn't play
of course,
after a while.
yeah. No. And two of my teammates still live locally. They're out in the Williamsburg, Ladora area, and we get together all the time.
We would love to have you get together and tell your story to us at some point, or come to one of our events, or just tell your story to each other, write some things down about it, and donate it to the
I
archives.
don't do well in big groups. You're
No.
about as big as me.
No, but with your friends, I mean, just
Oh.
mean tell your story each other, maybe record it or write down some things, or, yeah. Well, one thing we've been doing, we're just experimenting with how these collecting days will work, but at the last one, we had 3 women who had played together, and they were really excited about telling their story, and they're going to, and against each other. And they're going to get together and talk, I think, about it, and maybe donate something to the
I
archives.
called one of my very good friends, Denise Long's sister, this morning to tell her. I said, why don't you come to this? She said, oh, I can't. She said, I've got somebody coming to look at my microwave because it was making noises, and she was afraid. I said, well, that's too bad.
Maybe we can get her to one of the other events.
Yeah.
That would be
Well,
great.
This is a clipping, and I'm in the front row in the far left side. Over here.
And as we said, we have very little about the 40s. We would love to hear your story. Oh, fantastic, a letter. All right. And what's your name?
Maureen Berry, B-E-R-R-Y.
Great, thank you.
Melba was my maiden name.
Thank you.
So, and I have a daughter and son-in-law that now live in Victor. So they've gone back to my hometown. She was teacher there for 31 years, and grandkids and great-grandkids all in the area. So I'm really blessed to have family all
Wonderful.
close, yeah.
Is it
So-
HLB now?
HLB, that's where my daughter taught. I'm gonna pass around if you. I just happened to see that in the Gazette this morning, this notice of things to do today. I thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. And so I quickly ran down to my storeroom and pulled out boxes. And
Wonderful.
I know I've got stuff here somewhere.
Well, I think you've made some friends here. So,
Clarence Loudon's.
Clarence Loudon,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, that was in 1960s and probably even before that. Yeah, I played guard. Yeah, it was fun.
Center forward.
Yeah.
That's when you got to the middle lane and you couldn't step over because then you were fouled.
so Jen, I had a question for you about why there was, the little schools stayed 6-on-6, and part of it was because of the conferences, and so you weren't going to switch. If your conference was 5-on-5, you were going to stay,
Correct.
or
Yep.
6-on-6, you were going to stay that way because you wanted to play those
Yeah.
teams.
Yeah, and you didn't have enough teams to play, or you would have to travel further to play. But I remember, so I played during the transition from 6-on-6 to 5-on-5, and again, at the time, you could have a small school play a big school, and that was part of the narrative, the David Goliath narrative of these.
Those little bitty
state
towns
tournaments.
bringing down Des Moines. so.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and so some of the early 5-on-5 tournaments, we see that happen. where when they're doing the 5-on-5 and the 6-on-6 at the same time, there's no class division. Some of the smaller schools often do play and compete against the bigger schools and win against the bigger schools because they've been playing the game of basketball longer, regardless if it was 6-on-6 or 5-on-5. But yeah, there was a lot of bureaucratic reasons why not to switch as well. There was the nostalgic ones and the sort of ideological ones, but then there was just the bureaucratic reasons as well. If you switch, you're going to, I grew up near Ottumwa, and so Ottumwa it's one of the largest cities that has no other large cities around it, and they play the Des Moines schools all the time. They have to make that trek. So of course that was playing into people's decisions as well. That's a good point.
Well, thank you. Oh, do you have something to say?
I just had a question. Hi there. Hi there. So I noticed that in the picture that you had of the Newhall team, I don't know who to direct this to, but there seemed to be wearing knee pads in the Newhall pictures. So I was wondering if those were standard issue, or was it a choice? Yeah. I plan on falling down a lot.
Yes, I think, yeah, there's a lot of pictures, a lot of early pictures. And one of the uniforms we don't have are the midriffs. So again, that was really common to play in a skirt and then showing the midriff. So that was common during a particular era as well. But yeah, the knee pads, so whether they were there to protect the fragility of women or they were there to acknowledge the roughness of the game, is yet to be determined. I know my mom probably would have appreciated me wearing knee pads more often when I was playing basketball. But yes, we see a lot of early knee pads.
I still have my knee pads.
Yeah.
Can I just ask Danielle, so you played 5-on-5. Did you hear much about 6-on-6?
I did, but it's because my dad coached 6-on-6, so I might have seen games when I was very little, but mostly I just heard his stories about 6-on-6, and lots of people in town, they'd stayed in town and they'd played when they were kids, and then their kids play 5-on-5. So
Which town?
Baxter, Iowa.
Okay.
Yeah, Central Iowa.
I try to know the small towns since I'm from a small town. We tend to travel in those hyphenated circles.
Do you know Baxter?
I like to try to place it in the school district. What school district is it now?
Well, so it's Baxter's its own school district.
Yeah.
And when it was playing 6-on-6, it was Baxter, and then it became CMB.
Okay.
So Collins Maxwell Baxter.
Got it.
And now it's back
Yeah.
to Baxter. So
Interesting.
yeah, they're back.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. This was a fantastic
Thank you.
presentation.
Thanks for
and-
having us.
And if you can, go to the Tuesday night program.
Yes.
Or tonight, we have another program tonight on the history of Ragbri in Iowa City.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. And you can see where the exhibition's going to be touring, and then, we'll have updated information about collecting sites.
And also the card about
What we're looking for, there's some information, a little pamphlet about the kinds of things that we're interested in collecting. It doesn't have to be 6-on-6, it doesn't have to be basketball. It can be any sport. It can be anything related to the Iowa Women's Archives, generally speaking. This is not a sports archives, just a couple of very interested sports faculty that are over there bothering the archivists all the time.
They're now HLB, and the
Yeah,
next town in Brooklyn is BGM.
Yeah.
And so when they play each other, they call it the Alphabet Bowl.
Yeah, I can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you.